Well, hello everyone. Today we're going to do a brief tutorial on how to use Python to make some API calls. Now, particularly what we're going to be looking at, just because I deal a lot with the medical side of the house, is this just real simple API produced by ICD10API.com. That's where I'll be pulling this from. It's a very easy to use API, not a whole lot to it. We're going to be passing this thing kind of a wildcard parameter of looking for this ICD codes and then getting that data back in Python and doing something with it. In this particular instance, we'll just be writing these to some files just for simplicity's sake. So for starters, you're going to want to bring in the request library. Once again, if you do not have a particular library, bring up your command line. If you have it, you're going to want to use pip install request in order to get this library. I've already got it, so you're going to see that it says I already have it available. So just make sure you install that first. Okay, so for starters, we are going to make a few variables just to make life easy. We're going to put the endpoint that we're calling, which is just a URL, and we're also going to make a variable to hold like a code prefix for querying this API. So for starters, let's just go ahead and make a variable named endpoint, and we are going to put in this endpoint for this ICD-10 code API. Very good. The next thing is our code prefix, which we can change this to whatever we would like. I'm just going to start with A1 for ICD codes, so we can grab anything that has, or any code that started with A1. The next thing we're going to want to bring in is parameters. Now this is where, if you're not used to writing things against a web service, it's going to be a little bit different, but not really tricky as long as you just pay attention to what that service is requesting. So on this particular case, we are going to have a few items. First, we are going to pass it a description. We're going to tell it we want the short description. So think of it like any other query. We want a description. We want it to be short. The other thing we are going to pass it is an R, which is going to be for JSON. So we're going to actually tell it the type that we want to return. In this instance, it's going to be a JSON type. And the last thing, which is very specific to this particular API, is a parameter called S, which is just going to be our code prefix that we pass. So that's what we want to send it to query for return values we want to bring back into our application here. So now that we have our parameters, we now need to throw together our overall request. So we'll just make another object and we'll call it our request. We're going to call the request libraries that we imported up here at this point, and we're just going to use a very simple get function. We're going to pass it a URL of our endpoint that we made right here. We're also going to pass it a thing called params, which will be our parameters. Once again, this is just a basic web service. We don't need much more than that. As you can see though, if you were to look through the request library, there's a lot of other things you can pass it if you're needing to provide things such as authentication, for example. The next thing we want to do is we are going to make a return data object to store the items. And actually in our code, at this point of execution is whenever we'll be making the call. So the second that this executes, we are going to be hitting that API endpoint with our parameters and hopefully returning some data in a JSON format. If we do not specify JSON, I think by default you're going to get the HTTP code, which if it's successful should be like a 200 or something of that nature. So at this point we would have our data. We haven't done anything with it yet, but just to give you a little bit of an example of what that would look like, we'll just iterate over, or actually, make it a little bit simpler. Let's just print out our return data just so you can see it. So as you can see, we have this well-structured object that came back with a couple different buckets. We have a search bucket, we have a total response bucket, and a total results and a response bucket. What we're actively going to be looking at is actually just the search item. So we're going to want to grab that from the data at hand. The other thing I want to do is I've made this folder on my desktop, which is just for ICD files. And what I would like to do is I would like to make a file for every single ICD code that was returned and make that the file name. And then within the file itself, I want the pieces of the description itself. So to do that, we are just going to iterate over our return data that we have here. Since we know that it's the search bucket that we want to bring back, we are going to specify search here. And now we'll just make a couple of easy to hold variables for our items. So our ICD code is actually going to be in the object of name, or in the search object with the name of name. So if you can see, we would be in search. We want to pull out name. The other thing we want to bring in is our description. If I can spell that right. Very good. Description. Awesome. So we are going to make these files at this point, but I want to kind of print some things on the screen as we go, just so you can kind of see what's going on. So we're just going to make some simple creating file. We'll tell it we're making the ICD code file. We are going to make an object here called file name, which is just going to be the opening of our file. And I'm actually going to copy and paste that directory. Remember, double slashes whenever we're dealing with the Windows because it's a returned character. And then that's our directory. We're going to also specify the name of the file. And let's just throw txt on it. And the last thing we're going to pass it is w+, which is just telling it if this file does not exist, go ahead and make it, and we're going to write to this file. So at that point, it would make that file with that name. So let's just go ahead and say, okay, now that we've got our file made, let's go ahead and say that we are writing the line within the file, which is going to be our description that we made above from that JSON object. And then we are going to just write. So we're going to call that object, say, hey, go ahead and write the ICD description. Very good. And once we are done, just print complete, let's see, completed writing file. Let's just say ICD code plus.txt. Oops. Very good. So now when we run this, you're going to see first that it printed out everything we wanted, our name of our ICD code, the line that was written, so on and so forth. Now let's look at the actual files themselves. So we have our files here. If I was to open up one of those files, we will see A15 being the code with description written to the file. Mind you, this is not a very practical application of what I just did here. I just wanted to show you how do you query an API, a very simple API, and the things within Python to do that. And then B, just some sort of an action. You know, here I wrote it to a file. More realistically, I'm going to be doing things such as putting it into a database, maybe doing an additional query somewhere else. But you get it. You get what we're doing here. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or if I can help in any way, please just let me know. Have a good day.